so now that we've chosen the size of our encounter, and we've both players have selected their factions, the next thing that is here on the encounter section of the rulebook is to go ahead and choose the encounter location. And like I mentioned before, this is a step that is typically skipped. However, if you do have access to an indoor and outdoor location, you can flip that randomly on the chart here. And then within each location, you can go ahead and flip either your random location for the indoor and outdoor. Now that's not terribly practical. And in fact, what I would do is, if I had access to indoor and outdoor locations, I would stick to this one chart here. Ooh. Yeah, I'd stick to the one chart there in 63, and then move on, and then build your table based on that. The way I normally do that is I have tables in pairs, so I normally go 2, 4, 6, or 8 tables, and I try to have one indoor location and one outdoor location, just in case somebody is playing and wants to flip a random indoor or outdoor location instead of just playing on whatever table that they have. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and set up the terrain, and I've already set up the terrain, and there are some general rules and guidelines that I think that we need to follow here when we're setting terrain. Okay, so as far as setting up terrain is concerned, the rulebook has some general guidelines for setting up terrain, and they're pretty good guidelines. I'm just going to add a couple of thoughts in addition to that. So according to the rulebook here, a typical board of Malifaux, a 3x3 board, should have anywhere between 2 to 4 pieces of terrain per square foot of the gaming area. And the typical dimensions of that terrain should be about 3 inches by 3 inches if possible. This is roughly 3 inches on that dimension, maybe a little bit longer on the other dimension. So they're saying 2 to 4 pieces per square foot of terrain, roughly about this size. At 9 square feet of terrain, we're talking anywhere from 18 to 27 individual pieces of terrain that size. That's the guideline. Typically what we tell people, or what I tell people when they're building tables, is you do want anywhere between, say, 18 to 24 pieces of terrain, because there's going to be some pieces of terrain that are quite large, and you don't want a completely uniform board. That would be a very bad thing, because then your gaming area becomes gameable. There's a certain predictability to having all the same size and type of terrain, so you want to avoid that. You want to have some terrain that is of different heights, for example, so that they become blocking in some cases and just obscuring in other cases. You're also going to want to have some climbable terrain. You're going to want to have some severe terrain, obscuring terrain like the middle of the little temple there, and you're going to want to have some impassable terrain like the tip top of that monument all the way out there. So mixing up terrain is a great idea. The one thing I would say this board is missing is maybe some hazardous terrain. And I think that if I'm going to critique my own tables, I generally don't have a piece of hazardous terrain. And I do feel that the different types of terrain that you can fit on one table, the better off your game is going to be. Things like blocking terrain, obscuring terrain, you don't want to go with one particular type only or another particular type. And I know I'm saying this with a table full of all stone and rock and so forth, but if you consider relative heights and you consider different areas of the terrain, there is both blocking and obscuring terrain on this table. One other thing I would mention about terrain is my general thing is I try to take like large perchable pieces, I call them, pieces where a sniper can get up and shoot. I try to keep them out of deployment zones and more towards the middle of the table. That encourages players to move up a little bit. That gives them some opportunity in the early game to jockey for position rather than being able to, say, park a sniper, on top of the table in their deployment zone. That say if this was Nino, for example. I know it's not. It's Vanessa, but let's say if you had Nino up here and this was in your deployment zone, that might be considered an advantage to be able to just park Nino up there turn 1, and then with his massive range on his rifle, be able to control a large section of the board without having to waste any actions moving. So yeah, you're going to want to move large perchable pieces of terrain towards the middle of the board. The other thing I would say is when you consider spacing between different elements, different pieces of terrain, you always have to be mindful of that 50 mil large base size. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, it's for supply wagon, if you have that strategy. So you're going to want to make sure that your supply wagon on both sides of the board can fit between pieces of terrain. So when I'm putting down terrain, I make sure that 50 mil marker can get around the board. The other reason why you might do that is because of certain templates, flame walls, immolate pillars, and so forth. That's not a necessary thing. I would say the 50 mil marker is really more about allowing your supply wagons to work as they're intended. The last thing I guess I would say here about terrain and spacing is you're going to want to have a fairly dense middle as opposed to the rest of the board. So the more varied the middle of the board can be, the more interesting the game can be. So for example, I put that sort of wrecked monument in the middle there. Like I said, it's several different things at once. It is obscuring in some areas. It is completely blocking in other areas. It can restrict base sizes depending on where you enter. Using my 50 mil example, you can't bring your 50 mil this way, but you can come in that way, and you can come in on another way from the other side of the table. So that does restrict the movement just a little bit. It causes for some very interesting scenarios to happen mid-table, and that's where a lot of the fighting happens in a lot of these games. So just try to keep those things in mind. You're thinking about spacing, you're thinking about the placement of large pieces versus small pieces, mixing all of those up, keeping the variety of terrain on the board, and then finally theming it, because Malifaux, above a lot of other tabletop games out there, encompasses a wide variety of terrain. It's not your typical war game where it's always outdoor locations and they put up 2 to 4 forests and 1 building, or maybe some wrecked buildings and so forth. Malifaux has streets, it has woods, it has bogs, it has mining towns, western towns. And then it has all of the interior locations associated with that. So the interior of, say, a large theater or saloon, or a sewer, or a laboratory, or a hideout. Malifaux really is a great game to mix up your terrain skills, move things around, and not always put out the green mat. And if you are putting out the green mat, you can put out a Western mat one day. You could put out an Asian-themed Ten Thunders map the other day. It's one of the coolest things about Malifaux. Please do not skip over the terrain. And this is coming from a guy who is absolutely horrible at building terrain. You can see all this terrain is actually all store-bought. But I do have some stuff that I made myself. But this is just my throw-out table, and be happy with it. Gale Force 9 makes this stuff. That's GW stuff. That's some old, I forget the name of that company that makes resin terrain. It was Terrain Forge or something. But anyway, celebrate the terrain that's on the board. Make use of it, because it's a very cool feature of the game.